thought it'd be more fitting with all the media attention right now to talk about the Central Park Five uh, docu-series that has just been put out. It's not a movie, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a movie. It's what they call a docu-series. It's a depiction of an actual event. I grew up in New Jersey, so when this was going on, I was just getting out of high school. I graduated high school in 1984, and in 1989, this travesty of justice took place. So we're going to dedicate the first portion of this show to that. We will talk about other things, but we thought it would be more fitting to speak about that because it's still relative today, Antoine. Um, you implored me to watch it. That's everybody.
Yeah, just it's just announcement.
Okay. You implored me to watch it. So, my argument to you was I lived through it, and it's like anything else. As much as you think you know it, unless you're on the inside, there are things that you really don't know. The thing I liked about this docu-series is it showed these young boys as young boys, as they were, not as criminals, not as animals, but as young boys that got sucked up into a system. Their parents weren't bad parents. They were just struggling parents that were uninformed, and there weren't mechanisms in place to help inform them. There weren't mechanisms in place for them to really have any redress for some of the things that happened. So I know I'm prattling on, so just jump on in here, Antoine.
Now, one thing I do want to say is that one thing the documentary does, and I want us to make clear, one thing the documentary does is it presents the district attorney, Linda Fairstein, as the villain. And she is a villain. And I think that the A is an operative word here because what we saw was a breakdown in every step of the process, from their arrest to their illegal and torturous holding, where they were interrogated for long hours without any kind of attorney present by cops who were threatening them, to the prosecution itself, and to their eventual incarceration. These people served somewhere between 6 to 10 years, each of them, Herschel.
12.
Between 6 and 12 years, my bad. And they felt every single one of those years. They lost time because of those years. They lost school because of those years. One of them committed suicide as a consequence of the time that they ended up having to spend.
Not just time, man. They lost their child.
Yeah, they sure did.
The most important part of a human being's life is their child.
But one thing I do want to say is that these children lost their lives because the people of New York wanted it that way. There was a clamor for blood that was stoked by the media, that was stoked by the fears of both white and black suburbanites, that was stoked by the growing sense and the growing narrative that was forming in both the Reagan administration and during the crack epidemic, where black children were being criminalized in a way that aged them up in the perceptions of police. When they were using terms like "wild and out," they thought that these were black animals who were seeking to, eat other human beings alive and just rape them with no recourse. But no, they specifically dehumanized. This was part of a process of dehumanization that started with that was targeted on black youth, yes, but that was started with the adult population in cities like that. When you think about someone like your dear president, Herschel, when you think about someone like your dear president who took thousands of dollars of his own money to run an ad in the New York Times, which is considered
about 58,000.
Yes. Tens of thousands of dollars to take out an ad in your paper of record, the New York Times, to call for the lynching and to call for the execution of these innocent black children. And you know what? One thing that we should say is that Donald Trump was successful. This is one of his initial forays into public politics, and he was able to get the death penalty revived in New York, specifically as a consequence of the reaction to this case. So when we think about the enemy, we can't think in terms of single people. This is not about a single racist white woman. It's not about a single, a few bad apples in the police force. This is about a system of justice, a system of quote unquote justice, following the dictates of a racist population to continue the criminalization of Black youth with the purpose of either ending their lives or disappearing them for life. And when we think about this, we have to think about this systemically because, we're in an era where, particularly after Black Lives Matter, we're asking for people are asking correctly for criminal justice reform. But if the point of the criminal justice system is to make sure that your children are caged, if the point of the criminal justice system is to make sure that you are caged, how can we expect reform to come out of something that's structurally and out of a system that takes as its goal the end of your life? And this does not mean that as a defensive matter you cannot take measures to minimize the risk, but it does mean that the risk is inherent to the system. It does mean that the injustice is inherent to the system. There is no right way to do this because the right way to do this, this is a policy choice. The right way to do this ends with your mass incarceration.
Yeah. It's I was discussing with you earlier on the way over here. Like I said, I lived through this in close proximity. And I remember shortly following this, there was a large uptick in the mysterious Black man. Some strange Black man raped my wife. Some strange Black man shot my wife. Some strange Black man took my child. There was a cop that got, a Black female cop that got killed in Orange, New Jersey. They went crazy. And a bolo went out, and everybody fit the damn description, Antoine, including myself. I have a strange habit now. Like I told you, I get receipts for everywhere I go. When I stop and get gas, I'll get receipts because a man was dragged down to the police precinct. He was dragged out of his home, and his pregnant wife was pushed down to the ground. And what saved this man's life was he had a receipt from Wendy's at the time of the shooting. They kicked in his door in Orange, New Jersey. I'm telling you what I know for a fact. This wasn't on the news. It didn't make the news. They kicked in his door. They pushed down his wife. And the fact that he had this receipt from Wendy's at the time of the shooting is what ultimately got him off. Now, the same types of things happened in 1989 when these young boys were railroaded. There was things that exonerated them, and they still went to jail. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. And just for context, just in case nobody knows what Central Park 5 is, in 1989, a woman was brutally raped. She was brutally beaten and raped in Central Park.
Left for dead.
And so basically the rapist had left her dead effectively. And what had happened was that a group of children were in the park at the same time that this happened, but they weren't necessarily in proximity to the rape. And the police took them, and because they had a victim, they wanted to.
Because they had a what?
Because they had a victim.
Because they had a what? A white woman. Listen, let's not play games.
She was raped.
She was raped. I'm not saying she wasn't a victim. The reason they went crazy is because she was white, Antoine, is my point. There was lots of crimes that went on that night.
Oh, certainly.
There was lots of crimes that went on that night. They pressed these Black boys because she was white. Listen, I'm not here to incite anything, but let's call it for what it was. They were railroaded because they were Black youth. There were other people in that park too, Antoine. They decided that these Black young men were animals. They decided that they were out there doing all types of things against white society. Come on,
I don't necessarily think you're incorrect, but it's still true that she was a victim.
I'm not minimizing.
I'm not saying you're minimizing.
Only thing I'm saying, they didn't do it.
What I'm doing, that's clear. But I'm just giving context for in case people aren't aware of. There actually was.
What happened to her was horrible.
Yeah.
Don't. So nobody take that out of context. I'm not saying she wasn't a victim. I'm not saying what happened to her wasn't horrible, and the person that did it deserves to rot in jail. That's what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying? I'm just putting everything into context as far as what happened.
Right. But
with these
yeah,
boys.
but yeah, it is still essential to note that there was a victim.
Yes,
But
yes.
but well, the process of criminalization means that even without physical evidence, these children were able to be picked up as perpetrators
And became victims themselves.
Yes, and became victims themselves. Absolutely. And what had happened is that these children who ranged in age from, I believe, 13 to 16.
Yes.
13 to 16. They were taken by the police based on spurious descriptions and no physical evidence whatsoever. And they were forced into confessions. They were coached into confessions without an attorney present, without their parents called or notified. They were effectively kidnapped and they were interrogated at length. You can say that they were tortured, honestly, because they were kept in a place, without food, without water. They were sleep deprived, Herschel. They were kept in this place until they said what the cops wanted them to say, and then they were carted off to prison.
Yeah.
And that's effectively how this did. Now, again, when we talk about enemies of the system, this was done in collaboration with the police. This was done in collaboration with the public. This was done in collaboration with the media. And this was done in collaboration with the prosecutor. And again, these people going to jail, for the children, it was one of the worst periods of their lives. But for the people involved, this was a mark of pride in their career. Linda Fairstein, the district attorney involved, she actually was able to, she became a famous lawyer at a law firm. She wrote books. She's a multi-millionaire. She sits on boards. Herschel, she sat on boards. She had her own publishing deal. But you know what? She also represents Harvey Weinstein, Herschel.
Well, he's a rapist. He's a real rapist.
Yeah.
He's a real rapist. She'll represent a real rapist and railroad the ones that are not. Okay.
But again, we have to when we talk about the system, when we talk about the injustice in the criminal justice system, we have to get away from the idea that injustice is incidental to the system itself. The reason why this was able to happen is because the system is actually pre-primed for this to happen. You're in a place where stop and frisk are regular occurrences. You're in a place where police brutality is a regular occurrence, where in both the prison themselves and the streets, black men are constantly under various kinds of sexual assault. This is a regular occurrence with engagements with the police department, and this is how the state wants it to be. It just so happens that we're in the same time where just this week, they're supposed to be in the last phases of concluding the trial for the officer who choked Eric Garner to death. And the lawyer,
the civil trial,
and it's actually not a real trial. It's actually it's in complete privacy. There are no reporters that are allowed to record it. There's no video recordings. They're not allowed to take pictures. They're only allowed to take notes, Herschel. And the portion of the trial that was actually about the police officer, nobody was able to attend that except for the judge, Herschel. Now again, this is the criminal justice system as it actually operates. So you have a man who is on videotape actually choking a man to death. He choked a man to death, and there is no, he's very likely, and this trial isn't about prosecuting him for choking him to death. This is about whether or not he'll get fired for it. And the being fired is the only penalty that he will legally face as a consequence of his actions here. And we can't even guarantee that. So we have to view this stuff as, this is the power that not only the criminal justice system takes upon itself, but it's also the level of power that many scared people within the white population want the police to have. They want those neighborhoods to be policed. They want those people to be locked in the neighborhoods. They want to make sure that somebody is armed to protect and serve them by beating you with a baton, Herschel.
Or shooting you down.
Absolutely. So we can't, we have to stop separating what we see on a day-by-day basis from the actual occupational goal of these forces. The actual occupational goal is ethnic population control. That is literally the only function of both the police and the prison system at this point in time. And this is something that has also expanded to immigration, Herschel. Immigration detention facilities are a mechanism of ethnic population control, and that is how the state views it. And this is how the people who support this, people who like tough on crime practices, people who support certain administrations or certain people in office, when they think about protection, they think about protection in precisely these terms. Protection either means that somebody's going to jail, somebody's getting shot in the street, or somebody's getting bombed.
Antoine, you mentioned immigration, and I saw a story this morning about 5,200 detainees have been exposed to measles.
Yep.
So again,
and again,
I don't think it's by coincidence.
No, it's not.
Let me tell you something.
It's not.
This country has
That's
a
policy.
history
That's policy
of experimenting on what they consider lesser people, on people that are not really citizens of this country. They have a history of that. Let's not make any mistakes, and let's not mince words. It is what it is. Now, if I'm wrong, somebody show me that I'm wrong, and I'll apologize.
But also, let's be clear that they're in those facilities because some 50 million people voted to actually have this happen. I mean, we can't separate either campaigns or democratic wishes from policy outcomes. A certain somebody was elected into office under the pretext of making sure that those people can't cross, under the pretext of making sure that those people are punished, under the pretext of making sure that those people can't get your jobs. And as a consequence, we are seeing full ethnic cleansing happen in America. But one thing I want to keep in mind, and one thing that has somewhat bothered me about progressive discourse about this, is that this was always the point of American practices. This has always been a function of American policy. When we saw the tough on crime legislation being written, some of that being authored by one of the Democratic frontrunners right now.
You mean Joe Biden?
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
Let's talk about.
Yeah, at least one.
At least one.
At least two of the people that are running for office actually voted for the 1994 crime bill. But we're not going to say that. But when we think about the war on drugs, when we think about tough on crime practices, that as well was also a form of ethnic population control, and we cannot assume that the injustice is it's because it's just a few bad apples just acting in a way that's outside the system. No, that's actually the point of the system. That is the system. That's the point of the system. And the only actual redress for something like that isn't to reform it, it's to actually call for its dismantlement. Because there's no just way to actually execute a system whose entire purpose is ethnic population control version. Yeah. And unfortunately, what the Central Park Five represent. And I'm glad that Ava Duvernay, who made the documentary, you can see the name of the documentary is When They See Us.
When They See Us.
It's on Netflix.
Netflix docuseries.
Yeah, it's on Netflix.
Four-parter.
And it's a 4-part Netflix docuseries. And according to Netflix's own internal analytics, it is apparently the most watched show on Netflix every day of this month.
Great.
It is good. It is good. And it's also partially why it was able to extract consequences that we had never seen before.
What are you talking about?
Well,
somebody did something else wrong?
Yeah, it was able to extract consequences against some of the prosecuting attorneys, like Linda Fairstein, who's had to resign from certain charitable boards that she's a part of, and who's also got dropped from her publishing deal. And now, Ken Burns also had a documentary about it in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, on PBS. And yes. And it wasn't a bad documentary, but there was actually an effort to actually extract consequences on one of the attorneys. I think her name was Lederer, and one of the creators of the documentary said that we don't want any retaliation for this. We just want people to know the truth. Now,
how is there truth with no consequence?
Well,
truth has consequence, doesn't it?
Not necessarily. Apparently not. Apparently it's only good if we have the information. And
the boys got exonerated because the truth came out.
That's true.
So shouldn't the guilty go to jail? I'm just saying. There's always consequence. And the city paid them.
It did.
They paid
but
them.
Linda Fairstein has continued to have a very lucrative career, and unfortunately, she was able to quote unquote defend herself on the pages of the Wall Street Journal, where she attempted to actually blame them for an entirely separate series of crimes. She actually tried to say that even though they were exonerated of raping that woman, that they were possibly guilty of assault. And yes,
I'm possibly guilty too, I guess.
Well,
it's possible for anybody to do anything.
But again, this is we have to be very clear about how the justice system functions. We have to be very clear about how justice works. Justice is something that's used to crush the backs of the people who are poor, the people who are working class, the people who are black and brown. The powerful do not get justice. Justice is not something that's intended to apply to the powerful. That's something that we're seeing now. Accountability is a one-way street. Accountability goes to you, but everyone else gets forgiveness, Herschel. The hyper-wealthy get forgiveness. You know who else gets forgiveness, Herschel?
Police.
No, that's absolutely true.
Well,
other people who get forgiveness are the people who poisoned the water in Flint, Herschel.
Do you want to go there?
I mean,
Let's
again.
What you talking about? For those that don't know.
Oh yeah.
For those that don't know, let's talk about that.
Unfortunately, some of the state officials that were involved in the poisoning of Flint. Now we have to be very clear that the emergency management system was intended. Was the thing that was entirely responsible for switching the water to the water.
River.
Exactly. Now the interesting thing about this is that emergency management was a system done by the governor, by Governor Snyder, who actually usurped local authority. This is something that was not approved by the city council. And he didn't have to be approved by the city council because they had emergency management laws that let an entire municipality, a predominantly black municipality, go under complete state control. And when the state switched the water in a way that poisoned the entirety of the city, and they started getting then went to court over it, they were exonerated completely this week, Herschel.
Yeah.
Not 2 days ago. Not 2 days ago. Now, again, this is what I mean. Accountability, as structured in American society, is something that only applies to the weak and the helpless.
Right.
If you do something wrong, Herschel, if you poison the city, you go to jail. You get executed.
Oh yeah, for mass murder.
Mass murder. I mean, if you're in the car when somebody gets shot, you're liable for.
Oh no.
You're on the hook.
Especially here in Alabama, you'll get the same charge.
But if you write an abortion bill that forces a rapist to fight forces rape victims to fight their rapist for custody of the child, that's legal.
This is one thing with that. Let's stick a pin in that because we're gonna go back to that.
Yes,
and discuss that.
We should
in detail. We're gonna come back to. Let's get back to the
That. But
we're gonna stick a pin in that right there.
As I was saying before, accountability is something that in American society is only intended to work for the helpless and the poor, to keep you helpless and poor. And we have to stop talking about justice and crime in terms that presuppose that these are neutral categories. When somebody, a crime isn't made just out of natural law or more morality. A crime is made because lawmakers made something a crime.
Right.
That's literally the only thing that makes something a crime, is when a lawmaker makes something a crime. So the entirety of the criminal justice system, it isn't objective, it's arbitrary. It's something that's a consequence of democratic choices, and we have to be very clear about that when we talk about this. We often internalize the language of crime and the assumption that criminals are bad people who have done something wrong simply because they're in and out of jail, they're in and out of arrest and whatnot. But no, this is actually the system functioning as it's supposed to function. What it does, the system is the system is selective in its criminalization, and it's intended to criminalize you.
He's talking about y'all, black folks. He's talking about us. So again, if we're in this horrible system, Antoine, wouldn't it behoove us, until we can get to a better place, to help educate our people, to put mechanisms in place? Because this should have never, ever, ever happened.
As I always say, Herschel, I think the answer to injustice, the answer to oppression, the answer to evil, effectively, it isn't understanding evil, it's organization.
Right. Okay.
The answer to evil is organization. You have to have something in place that's actually prepared to respond to this. And I'll actually give you an example. It feels like I'm jumping around topics, but these are actually connected, and I hope I'm doing justice to those connections. But recently, and I will note that most of the story is hearsay at the moment. The only thing that we do know is that a person was shot. But in Memphis, Tennessee, Herschel, a man was shot by a U.S. Marshal.
Allegedly.
Well, he was shot and killed.
Somebody shot and killed. Because I haven't heard anything from the U.S. Marshal.
Well,
unless you got something.
So
we don't know.
The story that's being told to us by the Memphis PD is that a U.S. Marshal, and this is one's being distributed on the Washington Post, the New York Times, etc. But the story that's being distributed on those outlets is that U.S. Marshals had a warrant out for somebody, and he was shot in the middle of a neighborhood. Well, right now there has been both unrest and uprisings against the police department because they swooped in and shot him. Now let me tell you some of the details.
Well, let me ask you this. Now you said that the U.S. Marshals were serving a warrant.
Yeah.
Well, he must have been a murderer or bank robber.
He possibly was. We don't know. No, there have been news stories about that, suggesting that what he might have done. But
what was the warrant for?
Well, most of it's unverified. Nearly all of that is completely unverified right now. What we do, all we know is that a man was shot, and subsequently after the shooting, we know that a man was shot, and what most of the people on the scene are saying is that he was shot somewhere between 16 and 20 times, and that he was left on the ground for 5 hours, Herschel. And this led to a lot of anger that was directed at the police department. The police department came out in force to pacify that city. Now, most of these details are unverified. We don't know how many times we shot him. We don't know why they shot him. They don't know. We don't know what happened. There are conflicting accounts about that. But
right.
The reason
there has been no gun produced that they said he pointed at the police. There's no gun.
Again, like I said, nearly all of the stories are verified, besides the fact that he was shot.
Yeah, but the news story. I don't mean to step on.
Oh yeah, no. I understand. It's
just so frustrating. This crap is every day.
But this connects to what I was trying to say before. The answer to situations like that is organization. I will say this: I think that it's entirely brave for people like in Ferguson, like in Baltimore, like in Memphis right now, to actually stand up to the police and say, you know what, I live here, I belong here, I'm a human being, I don't deserve to have somebody shot on my property or in my view for any reason whatsoever. It is entirely right for people to say that. It is entirely right for people to be angry when the agents of the state actually contradict that and contravene that and treat you in a dehumanizing fashion. That said, these situations would be handled better if we had some political consciousness and if we had some political organization there beforehand. And when I say handled better, I don't mean handled differently. Do what you please in a circumstance like that. But note that you can have more sustained action if you belong to a group of people that you feel. I don't care what that action does, but I'm saying that you need to ground your anger in something that can be collectivized. You need to ground your anger in something that can be sustained. And unfortunately, when these situations happen, we're shocked. We're shocked when they happen. And the response to that shock, is that we have a reactionary impulse. And the reactionary impulse is not bad. Where it goes is actually entirely legitimate, entirely defensible. But the only problem is that there's very little that can come from that because it's not being folded into another political organ. So I'm saying that, our response to injustice, it shouldn't be to just wait until something happens and then erupt spontaneously. We should already have the mechanisms in place to respond to something like that, however we want to respond. And I'm not speaking in circles, but I'm just trying to keep it implicit. But everything that we want to do, we can do better if we have a plan beforehand and a plan after the fact.
And one thing you said, Antoine, is very important. Like you said, it has to be sustained. We can't just be outraged until the next thing happens.
Yeah, we can't be outraged until the anger goes away.
Right.
Anger is actually a good basis to initiate this kind of thing, but you want something more sustained than anger. You want some sense of obligation. You want some kind of dedication to not a broader cause, but at least an articulable goal and an articulable way for actually channeling some of what we see in situations like this. And that's all I'm saying. Again, I'm not contesting the method. I'm not contesting the focus. I think that both of those are entirely defensible. But the only thing that I will say is that it is best if there are organizations in place beforehand. Now, if I'm not mistaken, there is an organization in Memphis. It's called, I think it's called MLK 50. It's an excellent. They are an excellent organization inside there. I know Nashville has a Black Lives Matter affiliate. I'm sure that they have people in the area as well. But those are the kind of things that we need to be folding into. If you think that if you are a Black person in America, Herschel, if you're a Black person in America and you are just the slightest bit aware, you know that any traffic stop could be your last traffic stop. You know that that your daughters are more likely to be targeted. You know that your sons are more likely to be targeted. These are things that are realities for our community. You know that you see police more in your neighborhoods than you see them on the highway. This is a reality that we face as our community. And if you acknowledge that reality even a little bit, you need to go to your neighbors, you need to go to your friends, you need to go to people who think like you, and you need to form some kind of group. You need to have some place where you meet once a week, twice, once every other week, once a month, or whatever, to say, okay, this is what we're doing, this is what we're going to do if X, Y, Z happens. Because the problem is that when it's reactionary, when we only have a response after something happens, it's not only too late, but it's also more difficult to actually get in coordination with other organizations. So that's my only critique, and this is all in response to the point that again, the only response to injustice is organization. If you feel like this goes for the workplace, this goes for the neighborhood, this goes for the community. The only, if you're having your wages stolen from you, if you feel like you have been underpaid, your only response is to actually collectively bargain. Your only response is to form a union. Your only response is to go on strike and fight for your labor. And if you feel like there are police in your community, stop calling the police and make sure you have an alternative form. The militias are, again, this is something that we can do, you can organize to do, and never ever view adequate response as something that only requires your own personal action. You have to work with other people. You have to work with other people, and that's my only cautionary tale, Herschel.
Okay. Now, with all that you said, Antoine, I said this last week and I'll say it again. Don't wait until it happens to you. Don't wait until your son gets snatched by the police and held and questioned for hours. Don't wait until your daughter gets snatched and held against their will. Don't wait till your son or daughter gets shot down in the street. Let's stop all of this waiting. Let's educate our children as much as possible. Let's train our children and our young people and some of our elderly. Stop running your mouth, because the only thing you do is get yourself in trouble, because legally the police can lie to you. Legally they can lie to you and tell, if you're not being held, if you're not under arrest, you don't have to answer any questions. Now, if you are under arrest, your Miranda rights say you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney, right? Because anything you say will be held. Listen to me. I understand. So the best thing to do is be quiet until you can get someone to represent you, because they're gonna lie to you. They're gonna tell you, just give me a statement and you can go home. We have to protect ourselves. We have to train up ourselves. We have black lawyers. We need to have black forums where people can understand. Let me tell you something. I always admire and try to pattern some of the things I do after the Panthers. And one thing they did was they taught the law. They taught the law. Because a lot of times people fear things they don't understand. Now, it's not a guarantee, Antoine. It's not. It's not a guarantee, because even when this went on, some people didn't know their rights.
Yeah.
And they still was. But again, we have to try to minimize as much as possible this happening again. Because again, we can't stop it. Like I said, because the system is rotten from the head to the tail. It's rotten, and it's set up against us. It's set up for us. So again, until we can tear it down and make something new, we have to try and figure out a way to maneuver
I have two responses
in and around it.
Yeah, I have two responses to that. The first off is that, again, education doesn't have to mean just sitting someone down in front of a book. Education can also be done by osmosis. It can be done by simply being around people who know what's up. If you're in an organization where the people are generally reformed, even if you're bringing a child into that organization, they're going to get some of that stuff by proxy, Herschel. They're going to internalize some of that stuff, particularly if they hear it frequently. Just apply the same template that we use for church. We understand that if we take a child to church, that they may not understand everything that's said, but that when they need it, they may draw on the sermon of a preacher or the prayer of a grandmother or something like that. Right. We need to apply that same concept to structures. We can teach in action. Teaching does not have to be passive. Teaching can be a part of either an existing organization, or it can be a part of your learning process. It can be part of your learning process. Yeah, it can be part of your learning process as you're starting the organization yourself. And the other point that I wanted to make, Herschel, is that while I understand what you're saying as a cautionary note, I think that people should understand that, again, the only rights that exist in a police encounter are the rights they decide to acknowledge. And sometimes they may acknowledge your right to an attorney. Sometimes they may acknowledge your Miranda rights. Other times they may disappear you, as we saw in Holman Square in Chicago, where they held a black site where they tortured black people until they falsely confessed on themselves. This is the reality of policing. We're not talking about rights or laws. We're talking about power versus powerlessness. We're talking about accountability versus a lack of accountability. When you're in a context like that, it is not enough to actually know your rights, because what your rights are on paper, we have a right against cruel and unusual punishment, but what your rights are on paper does not reflect what can or what will actually happen to you. So we have to keep in the back of our mind that A, these rights are contingent and conditional, but B, these rights don't necessarily apply to us sometimes. They really don't, and we have to. And the reason why we need organization to deal with that is that sometimes it's to be preempted. Herschel, if you belong to an organization that checks on you every other day, and you don't respond to them, they're going to know that something's up, and they're going to have places to go to find out what's up. Again, this is how we collaborate organizationally to respond to circumstances where we don't have this.
Take a look. I'm going to answer that question that was just sent, Ms. Lewis. I think you misunderstood what right about all the way to the bottom. I think you misunderstood what he said. He said it doesn't matter whether he agrees with you or not. We need to do something. I think you misunderstood what he said, because he very clearly said that we need to do whatever we need to do. Whether he agrees with it or not, the idea is to collect about it.
Yes, absolutely.
I just want you to,
absolutely. Yes, and then to use your point, during the Civil Rights Movement, we had student protesters, we had nonviolent protesters, we had organized preachers, but we also had the Deacons for Defense and Justice. We also had the Panthers. We also had groups that were collaborating both individually and themselves for either armament or anything else. So, I think that this is one of those situations where we have to note that there are multiple paths to the same end, and that sometimes those paths can be complementary.
Right.
And I think that one of the things that one of the risks that we have to be careful of is that when we individualize injustice, when we individualize protest, it depoliticizes it.
Right.
And what I mean by depoliticizing it is that it means that you can't form your opinion or your new reaction. You can't form that into a party. You can't form that into a demographic electoral group. You can't form that into some kind of collective union. Right. So when it's just you going to a protest and then leaving, that becomes dead political action because it's not being folded into something that can be sustained. So again, this is one of those situations where I'm going to say I don't necessarily care about why you're coming together. When you're reacting to a situation like that and you're deciding to go on the front lines, it is always going to be better for you to have an organization to go into and to come out of when you do that. When we think about a group like this, the reason why Herschel's mentioned the Nation of Islam frequently. The reason why Nation of Islam is effective is because they come out organizationally, Herschel.
Right. Exactly.
And again, it's true that they have small confines. It's true that they're concentrated chiefly in Chicago, but it's also true that when you're able to appear in force, when you're able to appear as a group that belongs to one another,
they have presence in every major city in America.
And they also have presence in every major protest.
Let me tell you something. You and I were at a protest
in Troy
for Ulysses
Wilkerson.
Ulysses Wilkerson, that was beaten by the Troy police.
Yep.
And I pointed out something to Antoine that he didn't realize, that there was FOI in the house, and they were out there in force. Do you hear me? And
look, this is not the only. These are not the only people that the FOI has been with. I mean,
right.
When we think about somebody who organized Lowndes County, like Stokely Carmichael / Kwame Ture, Elijah Muhammad specifically gave him the FOI protection, even though he was with the Student Nonviolent Coordination. Exactly. He had FOI protection. So we have to be clear that. And again, this is not an endorsement of the Nation of Islam, at least on my part. Or review. Yeah. Yes. I'm just stating what the possibilities are. I'm saying that when you can come out and some kind of collective force, that means you're accountable to somebody. That means you have a goal. That means you're able to show power through that collectivity. But it also means that you're able to speak other people in. There may be other people that are not organized in that protest. Well, if you're seeing somebody that's willing to throw a tear gas canister at a cop, you're seeing somebody that might be actually willing to just show up at a party meeting, once a week or once a month, something like that. Again, what I'm identifying isn't necessarily. I'm not trying to tell people what to believe. At least not this time. I'm not trying to tell people what to believe. But what I am saying is that there are ways to create sustainable political interaction,
right.
And the only way you can do that is through collectivity and through consistency.
Right. And it's because you were going right where I was going. With these groups, like you said, even neighborhood watches.
Right.
You should know the children on your block.
Yep.
The children should know who the neighbors are and who the neighbors aren't.
Yep.
When a child is missing, somebody should know right away. When an adult is missing, somebody should know right away.
And that's one of the benefits of community.
The community, exactly.
Community.
You don't have to agree with somebody's politics.
Right.
But if they look like you, Let me tell you something, black folks. Whether you like it or not, we're family because of our situation. We the crabs in the bucket. And this bucket is more important. How we got into the bucket as opposed to us getting out. Because what happens is we're in a place with a bunch of unfamiliar people that look like us. And we're told we're the same. So we have to work together. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this damn bucket, clawing each other.
And criminals, the way criminalization operates is that we are accountable for each other's reputations, whether we want to be or not.
Exactly.
So we have to be very intentional about making sure that the broader society's lens is not a lens that we direct to our own community.
That's right.
Just because you may think a certain class of protesters are being unnecessarily violent and rowdy, that's what the cops think.
That's the narrative.
That's what the cops.
That
narrative is what the cops think. That narrative is what city officials think. That narrative is not what we have to think about each other.
That's right.
And we have to understand not only where that came from, not only where that impulse comes from, but how it's legitimate and how it can be better served with organizations than without it.
And again, we may mention of how the nation showed up for different things and other groups. Let me tell you something. He sent protection for people that don't agree with him.
Yeah, he does all
because the picture is bigger than the Nation of Islam. The picture is bigger than the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's bigger than SNCC. It's bigger than any one group. We have to stand united together. Whether you agree with the methodology or not, you better realize that we are in this together. You better realize that we're in this together. You may not like my methods, but you damn sure better stand up for me and make sure you stand up with me. The same way, when it's you and I don't necessarily agree with your methodology, I will be there to support you and help you. Now, I done said what I had to say, Antoine. Let's listen to a little music and we're going to come on back.
Okay.
You're listening to Real Talk with Herschel, WKCG 99.1 on your FM dial.